Margaret Roberts, later known as Margaret Thatcher, was born in 1925. She studied chemistry at Oxford University, a remarkable achievement for a young woman at the time. Margaret entered politics in the 1950s, winning a seat in Parliament in 1959. She quickly rose through the ranks of the Conservative Party. In 1975, she became leader of the Conservative Party, a historic first for a woman. Thatcher's leadership came at a time of economic and social unrest in Britain. In 1979, the Conservative Party won the general election. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, the first woman to hold that office in British history. Her victory marked a turning point in British politics and ushered in an era of significant change. Margaret Thatcher's arrival at 10 Downing Street heralded a new era in British politics. Her brand of conservatism, dubbed Thatcherism, aimed to reduce the role of the state in the economy. Thatcher's policies were often radical and sparked fierce debate. She believed in free markets, individual liberty, and personal responsibility. Thatcher's leadership style was direct and uncompromising. This earned her the nickname the Iron Lady, a moniker bestowed upon her by a Soviet journalist. One of Thatcher's first acts as Prime Minister was to tackle inflation. She raised interest rates, even though it led to a recession in the short term. Her government also sought to reduce public spending and privatize state-owned industries. Trade unions clashed with her government over her attempts to curb their power. The early 1980s saw a wave of strikes and industrial unrest. However, Thatcher refused to back down, determined to reshape Britain in her own image. Her battles with the unions would come to define her premiership. Margaret Thatcher's economic policies were central to her vision for Britain. She was a staunch believer in free markets and the power of individual initiative. Thatcher's government embarked on a program of privatization, selling off state-owned industries like British Airways and British Telecom. Thatcher argued that privatization would improve efficiency and increase competition. The proceeds from these sales were used to pay down the national debt and fund tax cuts. In addition to privatization, Thatcher's government also pursued deregulation. They reduced regulations on businesses, making it easier for them to start and grow. Thatcher's economic policies had a profound impact on Britain. They led to a period of sustained economic growth, lower inflation, and increased homeownership. However, her reforms also contributed to rising income inequality and a decline in manufacturing employment. The gap between rich and poor widened during Thatcher's time in office. Her supporters argue that her policies were necessary to break with the economic stagnation of the 1970s. Margaret Thatcher's relationship with the trade unions was arguably the most defining aspect of her premiership. Thatcher saw the unions as a major obstacle to her economic reforms. Her government introduced a series of laws designed to restrict union power. These laws made it more difficult for unions to call strikes and required them to hold secret ballots before taking industrial action. The most significant of these confrontations was the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985. The strike was triggered by the government's announcement that it intended to close a number of unprofitable coal mines. The National Union of Mine Workers, led by Arthur Scargill, called a national strike. The strike lasted for a year and was marked by bitter clashes between miners and police. The miners' strike became a symbolic struggle between two opposing visions of Britain. The strike ended in defeat for the miners, with many pits closed and thousands of jobs lost. The defeat of the miners' strike significantly weakened the power of the trade unions. Margaret Thatcher's handling of the Falklands War in 1982 was a defining moment in her premiership. The war, which lasted for 74 days, saw British forces recapture the Falkland Islands after they were invaded by Argentina. Thatcher's decisive leadership during the conflict earned her widespread admiration at home and enhanced her international reputation. The Falklands War began on April 2, 1982, when Argentine forces landed on the Falkland Islands. Thatcher responded to the invasion with unwavering resolve. She assembled a naval task force and dispatched it to the South Atlantic to retake the islands. Some argued that the islands were not worth fighting for, while others questioned the wisdom of engaging in a military conflict with Argentina. However, Thatcher was determined to defend British sovereignty. The Falklands War was a resounding victory for Britain. Argentine forces surrendered on June 14, 1982. The victory boosted British morale and restored a sense of national pride. Margaret Thatcher's relationship with United States President Ronald Reagan was one of the most significant geopolitical partnerships of the Cold War era. The two leaders shared a common ideological outlook, based on a belief in free markets, limited government, and a strong defense against Soviet communism. Their close personal and political bond played a crucial role in shaping the Western response to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. When Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979 and Reagan became president in 1981, their relationship took on a new significance. Thatcher was a staunch supporter of Reagan's hardline stance against the Soviet Union. She backed his decision to deploy Pershing II missiles in Europe and his Strategic Defense Initiative. Thatcher also played a key role in persuading Reagan to meet with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. The Thatcher-Reagan partnership was a pivotal factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Margaret Thatcher's relationship with the European Economic Community, the forerunner to the European Union, was complex and often fraught. Thatcher was a strong supporter of British membership in the EEC, which she saw as beneficial for trade and economic cooperation. However, she was also a staunch defender of British sovereignty and was deeply wary of any attempts to create a federal Europe. Thatcher's skepticism towards European integration earned her the label of Euroskeptic. She clashed repeatedly with her European counterparts over issues such as the EEC budget and agricultural policy. Thatcher's famous Bruges speech in 1988 outlined her vision for a Europe of sovereign nations cooperating freely. One of Thatcher's most significant confrontations with the EEC came over the issue of the budget. Her tough stance on the budget eventually led to a rebate for Britain, which remains in place to this day. Despite her electoral successes and international standing, Margaret Thatcher's popularity at home began to wane in the late 1980s. Her economic policies, while successful in many respects, had also led to rising inequality and social unrest. The introduction of the community charge, commonly known as the poll tax, in 1989 proved to be a step too far for many. The poll tax was a flat-rate tax that replaced the previous system of local taxation based on property values. However, the tax was deeply unpopular, particularly among low-income earners. The introduction of the poll tax sparked widespread protests across Britain. The poll tax riots were the worst civil unrest in Britain for decades and shook Thatcher's government to its core. The poll tax was eventually abolished by Thatcher's successor, John Major, but the damage was done. Margaret Thatcher resigned as Prime Minister on November 22, 1990, after a remarkable 11.5 years in office. Her departure from Downing Street marked the end of an era in British politics. Thatcher's legacy remains a subject of intense debate to this day. Her economic reforms, which came to be known as Thatcherism, transformed the British economy. Her privatization program, deregulation of the financial sector, and confrontation with the trade unions all contributed to a more dynamic and competitive economy. Thatcher's impact extended far beyond Britain's shores. Her close relationship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan helped to shape the Western response to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Her victory in the Falklands War restored British pride and demonstrated her willingness to use military force to defend British interests. Margaret Thatcher's legacy continues to be debated and dissected more than 3 decades after she left office. She remains a polarizing figure, revered by some and reviled by others. Her supporters point to her economic record, her strength on the world stage, and her unwavering commitment to her principles. They see her as a transformative leader who rescued Britain from decline and restored its sense of purpose. Her critics argue that her policies were divisive, that she exacerbated social inequality, and that her legacy continues to cast a long shadow over British society. Thatcher's supporters often cite her economic record as evidence of her success. They argue that her policies of privatization, deregulation, and tax cuts created a more dynamic and competitive economy. Thatcher's critics counter that her economic policies came at a social cost. Regardless of one's view of her legacy, there is no doubt that Margaret Thatcher was one of the most significant British politicians of the 20th century.